Assalamu alaikum. Today, inshallah, we will cover two very critical questions about the Quran. Why does the Quran focus so specifically only on the Middle Eastern prophets? Why doesn't the Quran talk about the Chinese prophets or the South American prophets? So these are big questions that we should deal with, inshallah, today toward the end of this segment. In this segment, I will be presenting some major discoveries that will be unsettling to a lot of people. But I would invite you first to listen with an open heart. So we will start with Surah number 14, verse number 4. That's chapter of Ibrahim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes a declaration, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن رَسُولٍ إِلَّا بِلِسَانِ قَوْمِهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, we have not sent a messenger except in the language of his people. Or so it was translated and interpreted for us. When I dealt with this verse as part of my effort to translate and interpret the Quran in a faithful way, that verse stopped me. Part of the methodology that I've uncovered from within the Quran itself includes a principle called the principle of relevance. Now, what's the principle of relevance? The principle of relevance says that everything that the Quran tells us must be relevant. It has some significant information. It is not vain or common. We need to understand that this is sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of everything. And therefore we should dignify the words of the Quran and expect them to be rich in meanings and rich in indications. When I read this verse, as it was translated and interpreted, it does not pass the relevance principle. In other words, this verse is saying every messenger that was sent spoke the language of his people. And the obvious question that I had to ask is, of course he or she did. What else were they supposed to do? Were they supposed to speak in a language that their own people did not understand? The verse is probably saying something different. Now, the early interpreters of the Quran insisted that the meaning of this verse is that the language of the Quran is the same language as the Arabs because Prophet Muhammad was sent to the Arabs. In other words, they were trying to argue that the Quran uses the language of the Arabs, and they used this verse to make their point. But then I ask another question. Wouldn't the Arabs have known that this is their own language? Why does the Quran need to tell them that? Again, this interpretation did not pass the relevance principle. Now I went back and revisited the verse one more time and tried to see if there were some things that were not interpreted properly. And I was able to uncover a new meaning based on a single preposition, min. Typically, min is translated as from or from among, but min in Arabic, the preposition min, has many meanings. One of its meanings is about, such as in verse 97 from Surah number 21, Al-Anbiya. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing the group of people on the Day of Judgment who will be faced with the results of their work, and they will say, Ya waylana qad kunna fi ghaflatin min hadha. Woe to us, we were indeed not aware about this. In other words, min with the meaning of about. And therefore, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن رَسُولٍ إِلَّا بِلِسَانِ قَوْمِهِ. We have not sent about a messenger except in the lisan of his people. Now it makes sense because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying we have not sent in this Quran about a messenger except in lisan of his people, the lisan of his people. And now I had to understand, what does the word lisan mean? And I ran into a phenomenal research that was conducted by a professor of Arabic language and literature and Quranic tafsir from the University of Damascus. And he has conducted a research over 2 decades that consisted of analyzing the forms of expression of the Quran. And he concluded in a book that consists of 2 volumes that was first published in 2016 that the language or the forms of expression in the Quran are dramatically different than the forms of expression of the 7th century Arabs. And his name, by the way, is Professor Ahmad Bassam As-Sa'i. And his book is called Al-Mu'jiza, and it's published by the International Institute of Islamic Thought out of Herndon, Virginia, in the US. And he basically conducted a research by cataloging all of the poetry of the pre-Islamic poets, all of the poetry that was ever published within the tradition of Muslims and Arabs. And he cataloged all of these poems and cataloged every expression used in all of these poems, and then compared them to the expressions used in the Quran. And he uncovered a major seminal result. And this is modern research that was not possible until we had some research tools that were simply not available 20 or 40 or 100 or 1,000 years ago. And therefore, this knowledge could not possibly have come out until we have the tools that we have available to us today. He concluded, for example, that in chapter number 74, Surah Al-Muddathir, which has only 56 verses, he discovered that within this relatively short surah and relatively early surah in the mission of the Prophet ﷺ, it contained 65 expressions that were not used by the Arabs before the Quran. Let me repeat it. In a short 56 verses long surah, there are 65 expressions that were not used by the Arabs before the Quran. He also discussed from chapter number 25, verse number 60. وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمُ اسْجُدُوا لِلرَّحْمَنِ قَالُوا وَمَا الرَّحْمَنِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is documenting to us in the Quran, and if it is said to them, prostrate in submission to Ar-Rahman, they answered, what is Ar-Rahman? They did not understand that word, which is repeated in so many different surahs and at the beginning of 113 out of 114 surahs, as we say, Bismillah Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. That very word was not familiar to the Arabs. Now, back to the verse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, we have not told you or we have not sent about a messenger except in the lisan of his people. Now, what is lisan? Lisan, the best translation that I could come up with is locution or vernacular or jargon or dialect. Now, what are those? I'll give you examples and that will become very clear. For example, if you listen to someone using the terms chap or lad versus man, you will understand that the first one is a person speaking British English and American English uses man. Another example is the term lorry, whereas in American English we use the word truck. In Australian English we use the word mate, but in American English we use the word friend. Arabs know that even though all of the Arabs in all the Arab countries speak Arabic, each country has its own locution. So Iraqis have their own specific terms that they use. Egyptians have a different set of terms that they use. They're all speaking the same Arabic language, but they have different locution, different ways of expressing their thoughts or vocabulary. Moroccans, on the other hand, or Tunisians, all of them have their own locution. And therefore, the Quran is telling us that every story that was reported by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran about messengers before Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam were reported in the locution of their people. When you read their stories, you have to search for what specific locutions their people spoke. And in the case of the Quran, all of the messengers were from the Middle East. So they were all using a similar locution that I would refer to as the Abrahamic locution, because it's focused primarily around the Abrahamic messengers who preached the monotheism in the Middle East, and they all pretty much referred to the same locution. This is a phenomenal discovery because it implies that all of the stories told in the Quran were told within a specific locution that we have to understand first in order to understand these stories. And this is a painful conclusion that necessitates that we should revisit all of the stories by first understanding the locutions in which these stories were told. As it turns out, all of these locutions followed the Abrahamic locution. I've done the research after studying the relatively new science of linguistics, and specifically focusing on the subfields of discourse analysis and pragmatics. And by understanding these two fields of the science of linguistics, I was able to extract a lot of the locution that is used by the Quran, which is the Abrahamic locution. So in addition to the work that was done by Professor Ahmad Bassam As-Sa'i, I was able to extract new discoveries about the stories of the Quran. So we'll share some applications. What does this mean? It means, for example, that when we come, as an example, to the story of Yusuf, which is in chapter number 12, we notice that there is one group of people who consistently used the expression tallah, tallah. And there is another group of people, basically the gossiping women, who use the expression hasha lillah. And that Yusuf himself used the expression ma'adallah. These expressions were very identifying to the person who was using these expressions. More importantly, and this is a major discovery, and this will rattle a lot of people, when we come to verse number 70 of Surah Yusuf, chapter 12, we read that at one point in time, the siblings came to Egypt and Yusuf prepared their packs by hiding within their packs the drinking utensils, as-siqaya. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, جَعَلَ السِّقَايَةَ فِي رَحْلِ أَخِيهِ ثم أذن مؤذن أيتها العير إنكم لسارقون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Yusuf placed the drinking utensils in the traveling packs of his brother, and then a caller loudly called, O caravan of donkeys, أيتها العير, you are indeed thieves. The terminology used in this expression, especially al-'ir and the letter lam before sariqun, is very unique and very relevant to what we're talking about. It turns out to be part of the locution of the siblings. In other words, this is part of the locution of the descendants of Yaqub, or the clan of Yaqub. This is very unique way that they spoke. So the word al-'ir, when you trace it throughout the whole surah of Yusuf, you find that it's only used by the siblings of Yusuf, which means that the caller who made that announcement is actually one of the siblings. I hope you're shocked, because this is exactly the implication of what I'm talking about. That means the siblings, one of them is the caller who actually called out about their own caravan that they are thieves. Now, why they did this is a very interesting question that unraveled all sorts of new discovery about the story of Yusuf. Inshallah, when we talk about the story of Yusuf in later segments, we will dive into the details. So, as you see, this discovery about the locution or lisan is very significant. It's actually amazingly important to the reinterpretation of all the stories of all the messengers in the Quran. Possibly a lot more than the stories, because in many verses of the Quran that are outside the stories, it makes references to those stories. And it uses the same terminology that is defined within the context of these stories. So if you did not understand these stories and their context and their locution, you will not understand the rest of the verses of the Quran. So I venture to say that because of this single discovery, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made available to me and I'm sharing with you, we might have to reinterpret the whole Quran from beginning to end. Now back to the questions that I asked at the beginning of this segment. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala focus specifically on Middle Eastern messengers and prophets in the Quran? The answer should be obvious by now, because the Quran is actually referring to the locution of these messengers from the Middle East. In other words, to a single collective locution. Had the Quran included other messengers from other parts of the world, it would have to refer to their locution, and the Quran would be unmanageable in its size and unmanageable in its complexity. And this is very relevant because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not bring the Quran to make it difficult for us. Allah brought the Quran so that we humans can understand it and can actually deal with the limited complexity it includes. The fact that it includes the locution of the Middle Eastern prophets and messengers that it talked about is a miraculous proof of its truthfulness. And therefore, one day there will be detailed studies about these locutions, or the locution of the Quran and the locution of the messengers of the Quran, and they will be able to be matched with all of the references, historical references, if they're ever discovered, to prove that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us the detailed truth about all of these messengers. And finally, in relationship to the question, why did the Quran focus so much on the Abrahamic messengers? We have to look at the Quran as a vertical slice in the history of mankind. Vertical in the sense that it tracks a single group of people across thousands of years, probably 5,000 years. And by understanding the development of the peoples in all of these thousands of years, we understand how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dealt with all of these peoples and interacted with them when they violated their oath and when they violated the message of monotheism, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded to them, and then when they accepted monotheism and behaved according to the values and instructions provided by the messengers from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewarded them. So it is an example that spans thousands of years. Again, if the Quran had to do this for all other messengers from all other parts of the world, of the history of humanity, it would have been much too big to be manageable and practical. I hope this was useful to you, and inshallah you will continue watching this channel. Thank you for watching.